There's a place I have found in the shade on the ground, far from all worries and troubling sound. When I go there to be by myself, only me, no one can guess what I came there to see. There's a sun in the sky, there's a cloud drifting by, all kinds of birds make you wish you could fly. And in the distance I see someone waving at me. I hope that it's you, but who else could it be?
Hey, welcome to Coffee Time here on Untold Radio Network, Monday morning. I hope everybody had a great Easter weekend. We did here. Beautiful weather here finally. All the snow that we've been buried under for 5 months straight is finally decided to melt. And we've got temps are in the mid 60s. Today it's supposed to hit in low 70s, and tomorrow might even be in the mid to upper 70s, which is unseasonably warm for the Dakotas and Minnesota, but definitely looking forward to it. Thanks everybody for showing up. All those I see in chat, we've got them popping on from YouTube and from our Facebook feed. Welcome to the show. This morning, I thought it'd be fun. Every week I usually get one of the hosts from the Untold Radio Network to join me, and kind of gone through most of them. I haven't had Dr. Russ Jones on yet from Wide Open Research. I did have his co-host Brad on. Great show with Brad. But Russ, he's still a doctor who practices throughout the week, and the availability gets a little bit tough there. But we've kind of almost made our way all the way through the deal. I think we're going to have Alex on next week or the week after. Doug Hajicek's son, Alex, who co-hosts the Untold Radio flagship show. And that'll be fun. But this morning I wanted to circle back and bring back Brian King Sharp. How you doing, Brian?
I'm good, Jeff. How are you, man?
I'm hanging in there. How was your Easter weekend?
Oh my God, it was amazing. I did a lot of work, but we had beautiful weather. It sounded like we had very similar to weather to what you guys had out there. So I'm ready for some sunshine, man.
Yeah, we were in the mid 60s, but I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt all day. I mean, it felt almost tropical compared to what it has for so long here. When they said that it might be in the mid to upper 70s tomorrow, I might just take the whole day and just sit outside in an Adirondack chair out on the deck, to be honest with you.
Sounds like a good time to me.
Soak up some sunshine. But yeah, no, it was a great Easter weekend. And, unfortunately, that's not the case everywhere. I know that there's been some weather issues. I was watching a little bit of the Masters over the weekend on TV, and I seen they had to close for a few hours when they say that storm damage caused a couple huge trees to fall over one of the fairways. And I was watching. Did you happen to see that video?
I did not.
I went back and watched that, and I'll be honest with you, maybe it's different there, but here, I know what wind looks like out here in the upper Midwest. When it's windy, it's windy. But these two pine trees that fell over are they appear to be about 70 to 80 foot tall, and they're about as round as your chest. They're good size, right? And as I'm watching the video of it, I can see that the flag on the green is out, so there must be some ground level breeze. But when you look at the tops of those trees that are all around these trees, nothing really seems to be moving. I mean, it didn't look windy for these two huge trees to just fall over. And it was really odd to me. But so around here, you get enough wind to blow a tree like that over, you're probably your hat ain't staying on your head. I mean, it gets windy like that. But
I'll have to check out the video. I haven't seen it.
that was interesting. I'm not saying anything weird was going on. It just is. It's odd that I know when you get within a forest of trees that simply a couple trees that are standing 8-10 foot taller than the rest can take a lot of that, and it doesn't appear that there's a lot of wind on the ground. Could just make those trees top heavy enough to tip. But it was interesting. I don't think they'd ever had anything like that happen at the Masters before, but it was just kind of an example of some of the really weird weather we've been having throughout the country in different areas of the country. Tornadoes showing up earlier than they normally do in the spring. I mean, it's not odd to have a tornado in April rather than May and June, but boy, they were showing up a couple weeks ago in huge numbers. And doing a lot of damage. I mean, a lot of times when you have tornadoes, they stay kind of in rural areas, clip the edge of a town, whatever. Boy, it seems like the last few bouts of them that you've seen on the news have just absolutely been destroying established areas. So pretty devastating. What do you guys normally get in your area for bad weather? I mean, is it, do you see a lot of it in the spring, or?
I mean, we have storms typically, but the thing here in the area where we live in, just across the road from us is a floodplain. So they have lots of flooding. And I mean, we have soccer fields, a few miles away from the house, and they're completely underwater at times if we get 2 or 3 days of like torrential downpours. But we've never had any issues here on the property, thank goodness. We have elevation changes and everything sort of flows into the 2 creeks on the property, and we fortunately, knock on wood, have not had too big of an issue. But we get a lot of wind. We had a ton of wind over the last week or so, but not a ton of stuff. So somebody's asking where we're at. We're in North Carolina, in the foothills of North Carolina, in the Lenore area, up near Boone and Appalachian State, if you're familiar with that area.
Yep. Yeah, that's another interesting thing about all of our hosts on the Untold Radio Network is kind of the geographic representation that we have. Myself, Doug Hajicek are in the Minnesota area. We've got Dr. Dean Bertram, who's over in Wisconsin, not too far away from us. But then we've got, Jim Myers with Sasquatch Outpost over in Colorado. We've got some representation up in the Northwest. And, so many of our viewers that we've gotten to know real well in the chats on YouTube and Facebook, you kind of get to know where they're from too. And they share the weather and the experiences that they're having. And it's just, it makes you realize if you talk about a storm anywhere in this country right now, there's usually a few people in chat who are in that area and experiencing it. It's pretty interesting to have that kind of live interaction and hear that kind of feedback from people. But so I was going to pull up a couple of things that I had ran across in the news. Well, I'll tell you what, usually when I look at some of the news feeds I look at, it's a pretty good mix between the typical stuff you're seeing on the networks, the Ukraine and, different things like that. And then usually there's a lot of intriguing stuff, science, weather, world cultural news. It isn't all politics. And one of those articles I ran across was talking about the lowland gorilla and its population numbers. And I guess the reason why I found this article so interesting, it's very short, but the reason why I found it so interesting is I felt like anybody who's going to involve themselves in an interest in trying to further the documentation of the existence of Sasquatch, and is going to be taking parts in these conversations that we find ourselves having, and what that would look like and how do we get there. It's helpful to understand different species and how they've dealt with population challenges and things like that, especially when you start talking about large primates. So let me share this and pull it up. Should have probably had that ready to go, but let's see here.
I'll say good morning to Daryl in the chat. What's up, man? Had a great show with Daryl. I see Jeremiah from Bigfoot Society. What's up, man? Uncle Bones, how are y'all doing? I don't like to miss people, but appreciate you guys being here, joining the conversation.
A lot of our regulars, Grasshopper, Texas Jack, former everything. It's nice to see a lot of our people showing up over and over. All right, so let's pull this up here. This will be hard to zoom in, but I'm just going to read you what this says. It says the western lowland gorilla is the most numerous and widespread of gorilla subspecies. Populations can be found in Cameroon, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Equatorial Guinea. Now, the exact number of western lowland gorillas is not known, but I did some research on this, and the latest kind of agreeable number that most of these scientists have that are really well funded in studying these gorillas is around 316,000. Which kind of blew me away. I'm thinking, that's a lot, man. That seems like a lot. As any species goes that's breeding and healthy, maybe that's not a big number. But, for something like we're talking about, I'm thinking, God, that seems like a lot. And I really started thinking about how easy it is it to see these things? Like if you go out into these areas, is it normal to see them, or do they avoid humans, or do you walk through the jungle and never even know they were there? That sort of thing. But one of the things I learned from the article is it says significant populations of these creatures still exist, including in isolated swamps and the remote swampy forests of the Republic of Congo. Western lowland gorillas can be distinguished from other gorilla subspecies. They're a little bit smaller. They're brown-gray coats and auburn chests. They also have wider skulls and more pronounced brow lines and smaller ears. Large numbers have not been protected. Now, that's an important part of this. Have not been protected with this species, protecting them from decline. Because of poaching and disease, the 316,000 number that they're putting on these is 60% lower than what it was 20 to 25 years ago. If you're going to tell me that there used to be 700,000 of these simply just a couple decades ago, you realize how fragile that population and ecosystem can be when it's not protected. And it kind of made me start thinking a little bit about, if we are successful in proving to science and the rest of the world that there is a species of Sasquatch that exists, what kind of protection would need to be in place to keep them from following these same trends, because it doesn't seem like, history tends to repeat itself, especially in the animal kingdom, But, I only bring all this up because I think it is an important part of the population. And the more that we understand about what's happened to other species and how they've been affected by certain things, it's a little bit easier to have us a conversation about what would this look like? What would we need to do? But yeah, even when you hear people talk about the possible populations, how many Sasquatch do you think there are in North America? I don't know what that answer is. I think if I was to put a number on it, it would be significantly less than 316,000. But yet you see the population on these gorillas and how that's declined 60% in the last 20 to 25 years. It makes you realize whatever number we're putting on it now could have been twice that or more when Patterson Gimlin, let's say, caught the film at Bluff Creek. There's so many things that change and are cyclic that we don't really take a lot of that into account, But what are your thoughts on it? You've obviously have had to have been part of conversations, hearing people talk about what their guesses are on a population size of Sasquatch and the things that would need to be done if they were discovered to kind of protect them and help them. Have you anything notable that you've heard people talking about?
Yeah, it's been a conversation recently on the show with a couple of different people over on Sasquatch Odyssey with Pat Spain, who is a wildlife biologist. And I just had Nico he works at the North American Bigfoot Center with Cliff and Melissa Barackman, but he's also a part of the fossil team and he does paleontology. And that was one of the things that came up on the show with both of them and other people have even talked about the conversation around conservation. And, Grasshopper was saying in the chat, I believe Bigfoot does fine without us getting involved, honestly. And I think it would be the same thing with you talking about the lowland gorillas, right? They talked about two factors that reduce their population considerably, which was disease and poaching, which means we got involved, right? Not necessarily on the disease part of it, but the poaching is certainly done by people. And I think it's very similar with Bigfoot. I think the population, in my opinion, is way lower than 300,000 of these things across the country here in just North America. And I think they're doing fine without us, right? Because the conversation always comes up, well, what do you do if they're recognized by science? And they say, yes, this is a real species. And we know that there's one right here in this little speck of dirt in Idaho, for example. Well, how do you know it's going to be there next week? Like, where do you start casting the net then and saying, okay, we're going to set aside these areas? It's a little bit different in areas where, maybe in Cameroon where these gorillas are at. When you're talking about across the United States, how do you start setting up areas and cordoning them off for Bigfoot? You really can't do that. So outside of maybe passing laws and saying it's illegal to kill one of these things, I think it really stops there as far as our involvement in just leaving them the hell alone, because they're doing just fine. If they're out there now, they're doing fine without us, in my opinion.
Yeah, you got to be really careful in understanding that we're talking about something that we're probably related to a little bit more closely than elk and moose and bears and things like that, and if they have a complex way of thinking and whatnot, it makes you realize there is an open discussion on possibly even like, what type of rights would they have to be able to enjoy and the respect that's given to them as a species. Every other big game animal is really regulated by, control by harvest in order to keep population levels heavy or healthy. However, we don't have those conversations with gorillas because their numbers are so small. We need to try to get the numbers back up. I don't believe that. I do believe that Grass is absolutely right. These things are doing fine on their own, and probably you could have the argument that the best thing we could do for them is not prove that they exist if they do, because what comes after that? Hell, as human beings, we have a hard time regulating ourselves, to be honest with you. I mean, you see the division there is in what's right for humans, and I don't know how, if humans are really equipped to have an educated discussion on what would be best for something that we don't really understand. Do you understand what it's like to live 24 hours a day in the wilderness your whole life? The way that we've had these discussions on my show before, the time that I spend teaching my kid to drive, or helping my kid with calculus or whatever, all they do is teach their kids how to be elusive and remain unseen. And that's every moment they spend is dedicated to the culture of remaining elusive and surviving. And yet we're watching football games, and we don't focus on that hardly at all. And so would we even be able to have a conversation on what would be best for them? I don't have a lot of faith in that, to be honest with you. And you look at how so many other things are affected, when we look at trying to protect something, how different industries are affected by that. Forestry industries, natural gas industry, all kinds of industries are affected by every small little decision that's made to try to help or protect something. And so the impact that these decisions have are quite expound, really. So I think it only strengthens the argument they're doing fine on their own without us getting involved. But
yeah, that's my thought, man. I think every action has a equal and opposite reaction. And for everything you protect, something is going to fall by the wayside, or something else is going to be affected by that. And I think the best thing we can do sometimes is nothing at all when it comes to human beings. So yeah, just my 2 cents.
Well, one of the other interesting articles I ran across had to do. I was at it. Kind of, it's funny how the timing of certain things happen. I was at my eye doctor's the other day and was talking to my eye doctor about different eye colors and whatnot. And he says, there's an interesting article on that. And he was telling me about it, and I couldn't find it. And then now, here, just a couple of weeks later, I find an article on this that just seemed kind of interesting. And that's that every blue-eyed person on the planet is the descendant of one single person. It's a pretty interesting article. It says, ever wondered why your eyes are the color they are? Well, wonder no more. Every blue-eyed person is a descendant from a single European who lived around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, according to scientists. How did they work it out? Originally, all humans had brown eyes in various shades until there was a specific mutation that made the change. The mutation is a gene called HERC2, and it switches off OCA2, the gene that determines how much brown pigment we make. So that's why eyes became blue. As for being descended from the same person, the evidence for this is because every blue-eyed person alive today has the same exact mutation. Scientists reckon only 8 to 10% of the population have blue eyes, and eyes don't fully develop in childhood, meaning the brown pigment can kick in later, causing blue-eyed children to end up with brown eyes in adulthood. And we've seen that happen an awful lot. If you have blue eyes, now you know your family is a lot bigger than you might have thought previously. Now, one important thing to consider here is that when they called brown eyes. If you ask them what's your eye color, most people who say their eyes are green, they're actually brown eyes. They might have a hazel or an olive color to it. It's a different shade of brown. But the amount percentage-wise of people in the world that actually have what scientists determine to be green eyes is only 2 to 3%. So if you've got green eyes, you're really in a small crowd. And those are true green eyes. Most of the people obviously have brown eyes or some variation depending on the amount of pigment that mutation kicks in to determine how brown your eyes are. But for 8 out of 10 people, there's enough brown pigment in your eyes that you're considered to be brown-eyed. So, but no, I thought that was interesting because I didn't realize technically everybody with blue eyes is a descendant of one single person who developed this mutation.
Yeah, I've never heard that. I have green eyes, so I'm in a smaller minority than even folks, but
yeah, I used to describe my eyes as green. They're kind of a hazily green, but I would think science would probably say I have brown eyes just because they aren't true that aqua green color, that you tend to see in people who have green eyes, or that emeraldy green color. Remember when I was a lot younger, I had emerald green contacts and I lost one. And I had some clear disposable contacts. And so I just, as a joke, one time wore just one green contact. And we'd go out to the bar that night or something with friends, and people would be talking to you and they'd go, "Holy smokes, do you know that you have one green eye?" And I'd always act surprised. I'd be like, "What? I do?" Like I've lived my whole life and never noticed this, But yeah, so you have green eyes.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell on camera, but they are green.
It's a small club. I'd be curious to see if anybody else. Sandra Piper says she has green eyes. I'm wondering how many people in chat have green eyes. It's because it's interesting. But how about you? Have you seen anything in the news that's caught your eye lately that seems intriguing or something you didn't know before?
I tend to stay away from the news. Honestly, I'm immersed in doing the shows and the research for the shows, but I've had a couple of interesting things come up on just in discussion recently on the shows that, maybe we can get into. And one of the things that's happened and I'm sure you've dealt with this, Jeff, because you've had people on that you've interviewed that have had encounters, but a lot of the time when we have these folks on that are sharing their encounters, you get those people that some of their stuff is out there, right? It's a little bit more in depth. It's a little bit more fantastical. And I always get those comments that come through about people's mental health, right? And I think that's something that, frankly, I haven't really talked a lot about on the show, but it's something that I definitely want to start getting into because I've had a couple of interviews over the last couple of months that people have reached out to me and sent me messages and said, I'm not so sure about that person. They seem like, and one guy even in particular, one listener reached out to me, I think it was on Instagram, and sent me a message. And he was like, "Look, dude, you were a cop for 16 years. You know when somebody's crazy or not, right?" And I'm like, yeah, can I go out on a call and go face to face with somebody on a 911 call and say they might have some mental health issues on board? Sure. Obviously, I know what mental health issues look like. I know how some of those manifest. But when you're talking to somebody about an anecdotal experience that they had maybe 20 years ago, it's a little bit more difficult to do. And I don't have a PhD. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And I don't bring people on my show to diagnose any mental health issues, right? But I think it's a conversation. Have you had that come up on your show? Have you had people on that you maybe afterwards, maybe in retrospect, or maybe they didn't make it on the show? Did you think this person might have some mental health issues on board?
Yeah, I have. I mean, a lot of it for me is not so much on the show. It's more just listening to people share their encounters. And I'm the type of guy that I don't care if it's something that I tend to believe in or not. If you told me today, hey, I've got a dogman encounter I want to share with you, or I've got a UFO encounter, I'm cracking a beer and sliding up to the edge of my seat, and I'm ready, because I love to hear people share stuff. One thing I try to be cognitive of is that, well, there's a couple things. One, just because it hasn't happened to me doesn't mean that it may not have happened to them. I have to approach things with at least a little bit of an open mind like that. The other is that even if I don't believe that this happened, that does not mean that they don't believe this happened to them. There are a lot of things in life that can lead someone to be under the perception that something happened to them that may not have. But another interesting thing that you may find some interest in is I watch a lot of videos from a couple different sources in the law enforcement background. One of them is Code Blue Cam. I get all of their videos daily. It's chest cam and dash mount cam footage of all these stops throughout the state of Wisconsin, highway patrol, sheriff's departments. And it's interesting on how these law enforcement professionals deal with people, because they can't make that assumption either, although they have to analyze what's going on here, right? They'll stop somebody and it's like, well, they seem like they're under the influence of something, but yet they don't smell alcohol. They'll give somebody the first step of a field sobriety test, and they seem to have coordination. And yet the way they're communicating just doesn't make sense. They're trying to factor in what's going on here, right? Because this person doesn't seem like they're safe to drive at this point, or the way they're comprehending things. Is this because they're under the influence of something else, or is this a mental glitch they're having? Is it a temporary one? Is it a diagnosed one? What other medications are they taking? I mean, when you see the questions and the run through they go with somebody to try to figure this out, in the end, sometimes they just have to land on the most plausible option is this person's lost it. You know, they're not mentally there to a point where they should be driving right now. And those those mental health issues can progress to get worse or better. So this may be somebody who a year ago didn't have any issues, you know, and it's just gotten to a point where they're dealing with something that makes it unsafe for them to be behind the wheel. But I think it's really interesting to see how law enforcement has to deal with coming to the determination of, is this person of sound mind or not? Once you start learning how they do that, I think some of that is applicable to when you have these discussions with people and people are sharing with you their encounters. It's more than just reading body language. It's understanding the points they're trying to make and the origins that they seem to be deriving from, and you know how they communicate them and things like that. But yeah, I've had people on the show that, look, just because I don't agree with them doesn't mean they're crazy, first of all. And second, I don't have to agree with somebody to be able to learn something from them. So I try to just pay attention to, is there something here that I can learn from all of this? But
yeah, that's sort of my point when people reach out and say, you know, that story was just too far out there. Well, what makes it too far out there? You know, who's to say that didn't happen to them? Maybe it didn't happen exactly the way they say it did, but in their mind, it happened that way. They truly believe that they had that experience. And were you entertained by it? At the end of the day, was it an entertaining story, right? But I'm the same way when it comes to having folks on the show and they start telling, because here's the thing, my argument is this: just because I have a hunter on, and I've got a great episode that I just interviewed a guy from or for the Sasquatch Odyssey podcast, and it'll be out soon. He had an experience like 15, 16 years ago while he was hunting. He come face to face with a Sasquatch. And this dude is torn up about this. He admitted on the show that he turned to alcohol to try to drown out the issues he was having after his encounter. And he is a very believable witness. One of the best witnesses, in my opinion, that I've ever interviewed when it comes to recounting his story in detail. And he had to go through therapy to get there and write down his story. That was one of the things that his therapist over a course of time told him to do, is write your story down. It's one thing to tell your wife. It's one thing to tell your dad. It's another thing to write it down. Mm-hmm. And just because you see his interview, and you'll hear it in his voice when you hear and see the episode, he's a very credible witness. But if somebody comes on and says, yeah, I had this experience with Bigfoot that lasted 10 years and I gifted them and they would bring me things and leave them on the porch, that's a little out there for people. But here's the point I try to make. Just because this guy who tells his story from 15 to 18 years ago seems very credible, he's a hunter, it happened when he was hunting, versus somebody over here who tells another story that sounds a little too fantastical, who's the crazy one here? Because guess what? If Bigfoot doesn't exist, and there's a lot of people out there on the fence about it, if it doesn't exist at all, then everybody who's ever told a story is either a liar or they have mental health issues and they're making the things up, right? So the point is, just because somebody's story sounds more credible than the other one, because in your subjective mind, it just sounds better or it sounds like it could have happened, doesn't necessarily mean that the other person's crazy. So, but I said all that to say, I'm putting together a show, and I'm going to get, I have a listener who has a PhD in mental health. She's been in the mental health field for decades. We're putting together a show, hopefully a live show I'll do on YouTube with her so people can ask some questions. And we're going to talk about some of the mental health issues that may play a factor in some of the stories that people tell. But overall, in general, I think probably 99% of the people who come forward and tell their particularly Bigfoot encounter stories are probably 100% sane. And they did have an experience that's very similar, if not exact, to what they share on the show.
Yeah. I did a show. I've featured him on my show a couple times. I've interviewed him, and he's a part of I feature him in part of the book that I've got coming out. Leon Thompson, who is a mental health professional, who really looks at kind of the signs that people display when they've endured something like PTSD or in duress, how that tends to correlate in how they share things and how it's affected them, how they deal with them. And I've learned an awful lot from him, just, paying attention to things that maybe normally I wouldn't have paid attention to. But one thing that I've learned is, I had an experience in which, for me, whether being a believer or a non-believer, it feels like by default, I don't get to make a choice in it anymore. But I operate without understanding how many of these are out there, where are they and where aren't they? And all these different things that factor into the likelihood of somebody having an encounter with one. I don't know where those parameters exist, really. And so when somebody says they've had an experience and they share it, I'm trying to not just learn what I can learn about it, but I don't approach it just because I feel I know that they exist, that this person's telling the truth. I mean, I've gone on record before as saying, half tongue in cheek, half serious, that, the 1,000 episodes of Bigfoot Odyssey, Sasquatch Chronicles that are out there, maybe half of them aren't true, right? Or are embellished to an extent. I think you'd be naive to go under the approach that, well, they're all for real. They have to be. I don't think there is anything that says they have to be. I think there's reasons why people will make up an account or will embellish an experience. But whatever those reasons are, the last thing that they probably need, if somebody's hurting or somebody's damaged in a way that they're doing that, last thing they need is me stomping them into nothing because I don't feel they're being honest. Now, I say that with the understanding, people need to understand, we're talking about people who are, whether it's loneliness, whatever they're trying to do to develop relationships with other people, they're telling something that isn't true in order to develop a relationship or with somebody that they perceive as they'll understand me, they'll, be my friend, this and that. The last person somebody in those shoes needs is somebody crushing them. They're already hurting. So I want to be careful about that. Plus, they're really not out trying to defraud people. Like, they're not out hoaxing something in order to defraud people or profit from it. One of the comments that was made in chat, and I believe, let me pop back. I think it was by Kevin. He said, I'd rather become more developed or get better than be entertained. I would agree with that, but I will say this: when somebody's sharing an encounter, on the backside of hearing it, whether or not I believe them or not, I really have to look at this and say, either there was some value there, it was entertaining to listen to them, or I really gleaned and learned something from that I can apply to my research or my understanding of something. Regardless of where I arrive on it, I don't think the end game is to crush somebody or to hurt somebody worse than they may be hurting now.
Yeah, I agree. And that's one of the things that I set out to do all the time. And I've given my time to people that have never made it on the show. I've recorded interviews with folks and I don't post it because and that's only happened a couple of times, but I think that there might've been some mental health issues on board. And I spent 30, 45 minutes to an hour on the phone or on the video chat with them. And I let them tell their story and they appreciated that. So sometimes if that's all I have to do to help somebody get through whatever they're going through, I'm willing to do that. Former Everything's asking in the chat, have I seen a Bigfoot? No, I have not. But for those that have, that's one of the things that it goes back to the audience of the show, right? You kind of know, like for me, I know the tens of thousands of people that listen to Sasquatch Odyssey every single week come for different reasons. Plenty of people come up to me. I've been at conferences recently and they come up and say, I just love, my wife and I put you on before we go to bed and we listen until we both go to sleep. We like going to sleep to the stories. And then there are serious researchers who listen to gain and glean information from encounters. And that's why I do the show. I like to put together the commonalities and some of the things that stick out in the stories from different geographical areas. And I like to sort of catalog those in my brain. And the next time I hear something like that, I can say, I interviewed somebody last year who had a very similar experience to you, and they were miles and miles and miles apart. One was on the other side of the country, whatever. That's why it's so important to me to document those stories. But for some people, it is simple entertainment. And when it comes to that, I like to watch documentaries. I like to watch true stories about true crime and other things. I like to read things that are based on true stories. Some people like fantasy. So there's a fine line between the two. And like you said, at the end of the day, if they're not defrauding somebody, if they're not setting out to make money off their story and they're just telling their story for whatever reason, I appreciate that because I think there's something to be gained and something to be learned from every single story out there. So that's why I let them come on the show and tell their stories regardless.
I see Leon's in chat now. His nose must have been itching because I was talking about him, but
yeah, I want Leon to be a part. I haven't reached out to Leon, but I definitely want him to be a part of that discussion when I bring Emma on and we talk about the mental health and get some insight and perspective. Obviously, I trust and I respect Leon's perspective on tons of different things, and that's one of the big things that he does for a living. So he's pretty good at that. So I'd like him to be a part of that discussion.
Yeah. And it's also, I've become friends with Leon for a while now, and to see himself, not that he really cares that I'm here saying this, but I want him to know that that he is an inspiring individual to understand what he went through health-wise. He is a cat who has exhausted all 9 lives and is still moving. It is incredible, the movement that he's made in the recovery of where he was a year ago and where he is now. And people can go to his channel and learn more about what he endured and what he went through. But, you know, he was basically found on his floor, to a point to where he had to learn to walk all over again. He just the other day, and I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning this, I was talking to him on cam with a friend, and he said, hold on. He says, I'll be right back. And he turned around and stood up and walked off of camera and walked back on without having to use any aid or a walker. And this was something that I'd never, and he was wearing blue jeans. And this is something that I hadn't seen in a year from him. And it was just amazing. I was like, wow. You know, so, you know, to talk about, to not only spend your life in a career where you help others understand the things that they're dealing with and help them overcome things, but to actually be a walking testimony like he is really quite something. So, but no, last Monday night I had Joe Snyder on, who we had talked a little bit about kind of how they classify encounters. You know, the BFR's been doing this for a long time now, you know, and perhaps when they started, it was the right thing to do. They made it very simple. Class A and Class B, visual and in the presence of, but not sure, right? And you look at the differences. I mean, seeing something 300 yards in front of you out in the edge of your headlights at 4 a.m. while you're going 70 miles an hour for 1.2 seconds is the same classified encounter, Class A, as somebody like Joe or the encounter that I had when I was 18, where you're standing in front of one for a little bit. I mean, it seems like there's a gap that like there should be an A+, A, and an A- as far as, you know, how those are classified. And one of the things that was in our discussion was the source and the integrity of the source. When you start talking about a law enforcement sheriff's deputy who is standing in somebody's backyard investigating something, and there it is, standing 50 feet from him in a spotlight, versus somebody who says, yeah, we'd been drinking that night and I looked out the window of my house and I could see it standing 200 yards away. You know, I mean, I don't know that just the source itself lends more credibility to one over the other, you know. But, and I'm not trying to discourage anybody from sharing any encounter despite what the parameters are around. I'm just saying how it's going to be digested and perceived. It's going to be different in some cases than others based on where it's coming from. But
I think it's going to be with everything. And I had this conversation. I had Scott from the Bigfoot Mapping Project on the show about a week or so ago. And that's one of the things that came up with Scott was vetting and considering the source. And again, you know, it's like Scott said with the vetting, it's almost impossible to vet an anecdotal story. You know, you just sort of have to take it at face value. And his comes in, he reads every single one of them. So if you go to the Bigfoot Mapping Project there's an app you can get for like $2 for the year. It's one time $2, and you get to see the full map, or you can go to the Bigfoot Map Project website and take a look at all the stuff. I think he's amassed about 500 or so reports over the last 2 years. But that's what he said. You know, I have to take it when it comes in, if it's clearly not somebody just trying to spoof or hoax.
I think that's the main thing for him, is being able to identify that if you don't have any indicators there to suspect that, then it is what it is, you know. Somebody who says, I grew up hunting my whole life, or I was in the military for 14 years as a scout or with a ranger battalion, or, you know, people who are in the outdoors, somebody who was a forest ranger, worked for the Forestry Service for 10 years. you look at some of these different backgrounds versus somebody who says, I've spent my whole life growing up in Metro Chicago, and last year on vacation when we drove through Yellowstone Park, 250 yards away, I saw an upright standing in a field, and I know for a fact it wasn't a bear. Now, when they say, I know for a fact it wasn't a bear, they're comparing that to their reference, their library of reference of experience in that lifetime against somebody who's maybe a hunter or a forestry official saying, I know for a fact it wasn't a bear. I'll tell you what, those are two different statements. They sound the same, but when you consider the source, they are two different statements.
Yeah, exactly. You always have to consider the source, right?
Yeah. But again, I'm not out, like I said, I'm not out to discourage anybody from sharing their encounter. Because I can guarantee you this right now. I don't care what your background is, whatever. Understand that you don't have a burden to get somebody to believe you or not believe you if you share your encounter story. When I shared my encounter that I had when I was younger, I certainly understood that there'd be people who wouldn't believe it. I'm fine with that. It doesn't, the reason why I shared is I think there are other people who have had significant experiences in their life that feel like it's too taboo to talk about. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my family. I'm going to lose friends. But not everybody's going to believe me. They're going to think I'm crazy. That's the way I kind of felt on the front side of sharing it. But now that I have shared, I've come to grips with the fact that I don't have some burden to get somebody to believe me. Everybody out there is on their own journey, and they all require a different level of data and proof for them to believe in anything, whether it's God, money, religion, whatever. What's better, Chevy or Ford? They have data they look at and come to their own conclusions, right?
I would say Toyota's better. But but your story came up when I had Scott on the show. We talked about yours because Scott said we were talking about close-up encounters and how he believed he was talking about pro kill or kill. And he was talking about he had never documented an actual encounter where somebody was injured or one of the things really threatened him. And I said, well, Jeff had a pretty harrowing experience with this thing chunked a log at him that it was holding and hit you in the chest with it. And he was like, holy shit, really? I was like, yeah, that happened. Right. So I think those stories in and of themselves, there's a lot of people out there who may have a misconception that it's all kumbaya and everybody who sees one of these things is skipping through the woods holding hands. And that's not entirely accurate. So for people like you who have had an experience where it did get physical. And I think that's important for people to hear.
Well, I shared my encounter in depth on a show one time, larger channel. It's gotten, 70, 80,000 views in the couple of months since I shared it. And they, I don't make up the titles to other people's shows. They had wrote down attacked by a Sasquatch, right? And I'm thinking, I never really thought about that as me being attacked. I mean, certainly if it wanted to kill me, it could have killed me immediately. I kind of feel like the number one objective of any of these in any time it comes into contact with humans is, I want you to leave. I don't want you to be here. That is the number one objective in order for them to survive, remain elusive, remain unbothered. There may be a few small cases or stories that are out there that maybe don't seem to follow that mold, but I think for the most part, they just don't want you there. And my problem was at 18 years old, even though I'd been in the outdoors an awful lot, the son of a hunting guide, things like that, I was kind of oblivious to maybe some of the things that would make a lot of people say, I need to get out of here. when it broke the log, and that crack was like thunder. I mean, it was just so still, and the air was wet and echoey, and yet I walked up the trail anyways. And then when I thought there was I really believed that this was going to be a black bear, and I didn't want to run away from it and kind of invoke this kind of a chase mode or a mechanism. Plus, it was the first week of June. This thing could be with cubs. I definitely don't want to run away here. I'd like to at least understand where it's at before I start retreating. And I was pretty convinced this thing was 40 to 50 yards away from me. So when I was standing there watching the deadfall, watching the timber, waiting to see that black movement in the cedar scrubs, and I just wasn't seeing it. I think that the reason why I share this is I think that they have this kind of escalated tier of response. They want you to leave. I'm going to break something. A lot of people, they hear that, they're going to be like, I don't know what the heck that was, but we're getting out of here, right? Maybe it'll throw something at you, a rock or something. They're like, well, I don't know where that came from. I'm getting out of here. Maybe it gets to a point where you're oblivious or you're ignoring these things, and it needs to make a vocalization or something. And still, if you don't get out of there, maybe it resorts to, I have to show myself now. Or in this case, I don't think that I wouldn't even describe it as it threw it at me. It had its hands underneath of about a 5 to 6 foot long section of birch branch that was about 5-6 inches round, and it almost effortlessly just kind of shucked it forward from its waist level and hit me in the stomach and hips and knocked me off my feet. I don't really feel like it attacked me. It was just saying, look, dude, what do I got to do to get you to leave, right? Because I think if it wanted to attack me, it could have swung the thing like a baseball bat and killed me the first second I was standing there looking for a bear, So, but I get what you're saying. I mean, this idea that this is all rainbows and bubble gum and the human nature, one thing Leon helped me understand is, like, if you're walking down a trail and you see some forest language, whether a structure or something, and you find a little woven thing out of straw and say, oh, it made this for me. I mean, why does the world evolve around us? Why do we think this thing made this for me, right? I mean, this is so human for us to look at stuff like that. Could have made it out of reverence for another one of its species that it lost. Who knows why it would have made something like that. But this assumption that it did it for me, it makes me realize the way we perceive stuff. I leave it this. It left me that. It loves me. It gets along with me. I'm not saying that's crazy. I'm saying I think I'd be careful on and not really being able to put yourself in its place and understand its reasonings for doing things, and don't just perceive it from our human side and think it does this for me or whatever. But I think that gets done way too often, and I don't know that it's really applicable,
Yeah, our perception is what it is, obviously. And like I said, I interviewed Daniel from Idaho a couple of days ago. That show will be out soon. He was the hunter that I was talking about, and he had a very interesting encounter where it went on for almost an hour before he actually ended up seeing this thing. And it was a bunch of knocks. And at the end of it, instead of, like you said, most people perceive what's going on with the knocks and the vocalizations as things of, you need to get the hell out of here. You need to leave. I don't want you getting any closer. Daniel's experience, to him, his perception afterwards, knowing what he knows about stalking prey and prey animals in general, he said he believes that this thing was luring him in because it only did the knocks when he stopped moving. It never, while he was walking through the woods, he was camoed out. I think he had a 308 on him. He was hunting elk. And this thing would only knock when he stopped, and it kept drawing him closer. And then it finally stepped out and he got to see it, and it culminated in a pretty interesting encounter. But it was very interesting. I never heard anybody say that they felt like they were being drawn in like a prey animal, and maybe this thing might have seen his weapon and said, oh, well, it's possible I can get hurt. again, it's all subjective. It's all from his point of view, but I thought it was very interesting. It's the opposite of get the hell out of here. He felt like this thing was drawing him in. So Kaiju Ninja asked if I ever had an experience that I can't explain in the woods. Absolutely. I've talked about it several times on Sasquatch Odyssey and other shows. I've never seen a Bigfoot, but I've had experiences that I think could be related to, including some gifting stuff that's happened on the property here. So
I love the way he asked that too, because that's something that we've talked about in the past is, I'm part of a network of hunting guides, and I always wanted to pick their brains and see if any of them has had an experience. Quite honestly, as close to some of them as I am, if I would have asked them, have any guys ever had any experience with Sasquatch? These are guys that all of them spend probably over 70 days a year in very, very remote places of northern Idaho, Montana, Saskatchewan. And I don't know that anybody would have said anything. They would have all probably nobody would have replied to the email, to be honest with you. But if I said, have any of you ever had anything happening out there that you couldn't find a natural explanation for, and left it at that, all of them may have replied and shared something. And in those discussions, they get comfortable enough to tell you about the time that they saw something through a spotting scope on the other side of a ridge that was walking upright that didn't make any sense to them. But they don't lead off with that story. They aren't going to come out and just tell you right out of the gate. For whatever reason, our human nature, that fear of being judged, that fear of not being believed, is going to make people very apprehensive in how they lead into these conversations. And I love how Caillou said, have you ever seen anything you couldn't find, a natural explanation for? And I think that's a great way to begin those conversations.
Yeah, it's a different question altogether because, right, if you narrow the scope and you say, have you ever seen a Bigfoot? Well, no, but if you ask an open-ended question about, have you ever had things that happen that you can't explain, you start walking down a different path, and it could lead to that, obviously. But yeah, it's definitely a better way to ask the question for sure.
Well, and it's always the room that you're in. I jokingly say I could probably walk into the bait shop on the lake that my lake home's on in northern Minnesota. It's usually a bunch of old fellas in there playing cards, I could walk in there just about any damn day and say, have any of you guys ever seen a Bigfoot? And half of them would just raise their hand, You walk into a cafe in St. Louis and ask it, and everybody looks at you like they're grabbing their smartphones ready to dial 911, So it's funny how those discussions are different in certain areas. I've talked to people who live up in the Pacific Northwest and in Alaska, and it's very easy to have conversations about this subject with people that you don't know. Those discussions are, even if they haven't had one, they don't feel like you're crazy for asking. It's more common in a discussion. Whereas, maybe different parts of the country, that just is like the level of taboo it feels exists on it differently, I'm just looking to see here in chat if anybody else had any questions. So what do you got coming up this week on your shows?
Well, I've got tons of stuff coming up. I've got a couple of different things in the works, but the one thing I definitely wanted to mention that's coming up, and I'm sure it'll air on Weird Encounters, and I'm certainly going to do a live Sasquatch Odyssey show on YouTube, and it'll be out on the regular podcast, is I've been trying to wrangle the cats and do a Freeman Bigfoot Files episode, sort of roundtable, right? So for those that know, Paul Freeman's son, wrote a book, The Bigfoot Files, recently. And if you've got that book, you've gotten exclusive access to the stabilized, non-interlaced version, slowed down, beautiful footage that Doug and Alex worked on. And you got to see the Freeman footage in a way that nobody else really has. But I reached out to Michael it's been almost a month ago now, and I started talking about, I want to do a roundtable and bring some folks on and show some of that non-interlaced footage because it is much better than the original. And for those, basically in a nutshell, interlaced footage video is just basically filling in the gaps, is the simplified version of interlaced. It's sort of a way to fill in the gaps, and it reduces flicker, and it's supposed to be a better film. But 99% of what you guys see, if you go Google Bigfoot Freeman file or footage right now, you're going to see a interlaced, usually digital version of this. But Michael has the original non-interlaced footage. So we want to release a little bit of that on the show and then have a roundtable. So I'm trying to get, we're in talks to get Cliff Barackman has said he's going to be a part of it. Dr. Russ Jones, Doug Hajicek, of course, Michael Freeman. I'm going to have Wayne, who is the host of my Paranormal Odyssey show, on there as well. And so I'm trying to get like 5 people's schedules together. So it's been quite good. You know how hard it is to schedule one person for a live show. And I'm trying to wrangle like 6 cats along with my own schedule, which is pretty demanding. So we're going to make that happen. And I think it would be interesting for everybody to be there, because you are going to see something that most people have never seen, which is a non-interlaced version of at least a portion of the film. And then we're going to talk about it, obviously have Cliff sort of break down what he thinks about it. Dr. Russ Jones is going to talk a little bit about it. Obviously, Doug, who's seen tons of videos, and he can talk a little bit about the process of how they did what they did with the film that you see in the book. So
yeah, it's interesting to hear Doug talk about how, there's a lot of people out there who believe the PG film is real, and yet when they look at the Freeman film, they had different concerns about it. And I don't know that Doug would say that he went into it 100%, chips down, all in, that this is real. But I think through the process of this, that's where he's at, and so it obviously does have a different perspective with it compared to what most people have seen. And I think that'll be a really interesting show. I think that'll be a great conversation for people to listen to.
Yeah, like for Cliff Brackman was on the show recently, and we had a conversation about that. And for him, it's, the video is still inconclusive. Video is always going to be inconclusive, no matter what you do to enhance it. There's always going to be people, naysayers, who say one way or the other. But for him, it was the footprints. It was the castings that were made there, because that same sample, that same individual has been casted hundreds of miles away by other researchers, including Dr. Jeff Meldrum, to name a few, right? So it's a known specimen in the database, which I didn't know before talking to Cliff about it. So when you put all of that stuff together and you take a look at the film and you see that version that's non-interlaced, and you can see this thing a lot clearer than you ever have been able to before. And then you talk about the foot castings that were taken that day. I think for me, I came away from, I've seen that version, Michael sent it to me a while back, and it's definitely convincing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, I've got a show tonight where I'm going to have Steve Coles and Thomas Steenberg, and Eric from Media Palace is going to join, and Joe is going to be on. We've got a little bit of a panel. We're going to have a discussion on, the future of Sasquatch research, and maybe some of the challenges that will be there based on how liquid fast the technology of AI is moving. We've kind of gotten to a point where anything you film in real life in 45 minutes, I could recreate with AI, and I could actually even write artificial metadata that you would not be able to determine is not valid. I mean, it has gotten to a point to where, short of a body and short of a lab giving an accredited, respectable lab giving DNA results to substance tested, what are we going to have video wise that we're going to, imagine shooting a drone footage of 2 or 3 of them walking along, and saying, I captured this, and knowing that AI could write that and write the metadata, and there's nothing to determine that what you filmed is actually real. And what does that leave us with? Where do those question marks get drawn now? You know, it's not a discussion to where I want to make it all about you know, technology. I think this technology is great. I think the advancement of technology, I support that. The way it'll be used in other areas is unbelievably helpful to humans, but this is one area where when it comes to trying to document the existence of an unknown species, um, it is certain areas it could be helpful. In a lot of areas, it could really be a detriment if we don't understand how to analyze what we're looking at. And I think a lot of that responsibility lies on the influencers and the podcast hosts and the people working in research and the people speaking at these different events to really respect the word evidence versus data. If I were to come up with footage of something, that's still data to be considered. I mean, you may look until you can show me that that is not AI derived and that this is an authentic video. Now, all of a sudden, maybe that data could become evidence, but I don't know that it starts there by default anymore, you know? And so, you know, we're not out to portray, you know, the race to get AI advanced. You know, we see it in pictures. Anybody could download on their smartphone. I can take 50 pictures of myself and then say, hey, show me standing next to a train in the 1880s and give it 50 seconds and boop, there's a picture of me standing next to a train. That's advancing to video now. It's doing it so fast that it will be possible to say, show a set of large footprints walking through foot deep snow parallel to a tree line and give it 2 minutes and it will pop out a video of that. And if you can utilize today's technology and write the metadata that makes that appear to be valid, we're kind of having a hard point in getting to the bottom of what's real and what's artificial anymore. And that's going to get harder and harder and harder. And so I just wanted to have a realistic discussion of how that might affect where we go from here. It's going to be in all areas of life. I mean, I use as an example, if you had a car that did 12 seconds in the quarter mile, you can make AI data and show your car doing a 10-second quarter mile and send me the video. And now, as far as I'm concerned, I have to recognize your car as being a 10-second quarter mile car. I can't prove that it's not. So, yeah. You know,
and you said it comes down to the responsibility of the influencers in the community and people who have the ear of lots of people. And it comes down to the conferences and the people who speak there and what they present as evidence as well, because tons of people are going to conferences and I think they're great. I'm going to several. I'm going to be at the East Tennessee Paracon, April 28th and 29th. I'm going to be at the, Marion Bigfoot Festival, May the 20th, and I'll be up at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference in July. I think that's July 22nd and 23rd. And I think it's important for people who put those conferences on and the people that they bring in to speak have some sort of a responsibility as well to call things what they are. If it's data, it's data. If it's evidence, it's evidence. And don't enter, because people take that as the gospel. They hear somebody like me or you or somebody on stage at a conference say, this is absolutely real or this is absolutely this evidence, and it may not necessarily be accurate. So I think you have to be responsible in what you say and what you do.
I think so many of the instances that we've seen in the past year in this community where there's disagreements amongst people who have following of a lot of people who look to them as being a resource, right? And you'll have one butting heads with another. So many times it's because something's represented as being factual or truthful. It may be just simply a hypothesis. You may have multiple sets of data that make you feel that in your area, there's something here. But until you can, understanding the parameters of presenting that as factual, a good representation of that was somebody who was talking about knock theory, wood knock theory. 3 knocks followed by 4 knocks means this. They may have came to understand that in their area, that was something that they were leaning to discover, was that there seemed to be a pattern there. Now, does that apply geographically all over? No. I don't know how to speak Chinese. I mean, it's communication. It could simply be something that's happening in your area. Not to mention, you may be just simply wrong about it. But to come out and factually say, if you ever hear this, you better run, because this is what it means. You are not doing this community a service by presenting that information that way.
I definitely agree. And people who have that approach and take that approach, I tend to stay away from on my show, honestly, because I don't like that kind of stuff. I think it's a disservice and it's not accurate, because unless you can prove it, you're just hypothesizing and you're just speculating like everybody else. So, and if that's fine, if that's what you want to do, as long as you preface it by that and understand that you'll never hear me ever say anything definitive on my show outside of definitively, we know the Sasquatch phenomenon itself exists. Outside of that, everything else is up for interpretation. And, we have a lot of subjective opinions. I have mine, and everybody who comes on the show certainly has theirs. And it's fun to talk about. It's entertaining, but it is what it is at the end of the day.
And here's a comment. Would you present something you experienced as factual? Did it not, in fact, happen to you? Too much attention on how people speak. I would disagree a little bit there, and here's why. As much as my encounter leads me to believe that I don't have a choice in the matter anymore, that these things exist in my mind, my encounter is simply data for somebody else to consider, and that's it. It will never be proof to anybody but me, ever. And that's a fact. That what happened to me, but it's only a fact to me because I'm the only one who was there. Other than my 2 friends, it's facts to them, but it's not a fact to Brian. It's data to be considered. And,
right.
And
it's
so
anecdotal evidence for everybody who hears your story to process and take away from what they want, and believe or not.
Anyways, yeah, that's I get it. I love when our chat is interacting with us in the show. We get great questions from the chat. I invite everybody to share their opinions. And even if it's an opinion that I don't necessarily agree upon, my number one rule of our show has always been just be respectful to each other. We can stand on complete opposite ends of the field when it comes to agreeing on something. But there's no reason to not be respectful. So I appreciate you conveying your thoughts and being respectful about it. I love that. But yeah, so that's what I've got coming up tonight. So it sounds like we both got some interesting shows coming up. All the shows that some people may have missed last week on the Untold Network are now posted. There were a few of them that were just broadcasting to Facebook and YouTube and not on, or Facebook and Twitter and not on YouTube live, but they have all been uploaded and updated. So, if you missed any of those shows last week, you can go catch those. But otherwise, hey, Brian, I appreciate you joining us this morning. It was fun having you here again.
Absolutely, man. I always love this.
Yeah, it's kind of different doing a show in the morning for me. For you, I know you do interviews with people all through the day. I mean, you set days aside and then it's like blocked out, I suppose, like every 30 minutes you're talking to somebody else,
Yeah, I think I have one in about an hour, and I've got another one at 5 p.m. today, and then this. So just the 3 today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for showing up and doing this, and we will see you soon.
Absolutely, man.
All right, thanks. And thanks all of you for joining up in chat here, choosing to spend your Monday morning with us, hiding from the boss. If you're at work, at least looking busy while you listen in. That's the important thing. Always look like you're busy. Yeah, don't start doodling Bigfoot on a scratch pad with your feet up on your desk. You might get caught if you start doing that. But certainly appreciate everybody who tuned in on Facebook and Twitter as well as YouTube. And thanks for being a part of the chat. We will see you tonight, Pine Island Research, 9 p.m. Eastern time. Should be a fun show. And if you choose to join us, I will thank you in advance for spending your Monday night with us. That is awesome.